Here we go. This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Brief Belief. And our hostess today is Candace Pollock. And Candace, you did a lot of research for today, so tell us what we're going to talk about.
Well, we're going to talk about the dying process, whether we're the person dying or we have somebody that in our life that's dying. And it was just happen chance that this came up as a topic for me. And I was reading an article in the New York Times, and to the right, there is often a list of prior articles. And there was one by a doctor who was a palliative care doctor. I guess she was a resident at the time. And the second one was somebody in stage 4 cancer evolution. And one was written in 2003, the one by the doctor. The other one was written, I think, in 2018. But I was totally engaged by them. And I thought it would be a perfect topic for this podcast because we often talk about grief as if it's only related to dying. And I know that we're not intending to do that. But I thought the questions that popped up in my mind when I read both of them, that would really be good for us to share and our own ideas about what we read, assuming we read it. And I presume that we'll include some links to the articles so that others might have their own direct experience with it. So my idea for today is basically just to I'd like to do a little summary of the articles, and then I'd like to just open the mic and pass it around so that everybody has a chance to weigh in on their thoughts.
Perfect.
Okay. So Dr. Sunita Puri is the doctor who wrote the article. As a doctor, I know that being ready to die is an illusion. And she has had patients who were in various states of dying. And she was always hesitant to talk to them about it because she wasn't sure they were ready to die. And so that's the readiness illusion. And there were a couple of things she talked about that really touched me. And basically, she was saying how that awaiting some sort of signal or sign that somebody's ready is probably futile, because although they may be ready, they're not necessarily sharing it. And what that does for us, maybe the person who isn't in that situation, is it means it robs us of an opportunity to have a deeper conversation about what that means for them. And the experience of dying, and that may be morbid to a lot of people, but it's also just part of that process that we go through. And then the other article is by a woman, as I mentioned, she's in stage 4 cancer, and the name of the article is "What to Say When You Meet the Angel of Death at a Party." And she talks about having been in stage 4 for a number of years, and she basically calls it the keeping vigil in a place of almost death. So she's not there. It's not necessarily imminent. Maybe it is, it isn't. And she talks about there's 3 categories of people that tend to respond to her when they know that she's in stage 4. There's the minimizers, those people who tend to say, well, at least, whatever, that is worse than that. The teachers with platitudes, like God doesn't give you more than you can handle. And then the solvers, and they're the ones that try to come up with solutions and so on. And I have to admit, and I'm embarrassed to admit, that I fall into that last category. And I deal with people who are dying all the time because I'm doing a lot of pro bono work for a couple of nonprofits that are dealing with people that are dying. And so it really was like a leash pull in terms of I have to pay attention to that. So that was part of my motivation for bringing it up. So I'd like to just, maybe we can pass the mic around and see what y'all thought about the article. Any particular thoughts or things that you want to make sure that we touch on today. So how about if I go with Christy?
Okay, so first of all, these articles to me were just really powerful. I haven't had the experience of somebody going through end of life, aside from my father-in-law, and that was, I wasn't real close to him. So it wasn't, we just didn't I wasn't there I wasn't very present in the process. But these were really powerful articles. And one of the questions that I wondered about is it made me think, what do we expect of the person who's dying? Like, it made me realize we expect an awful lot of that person who is dying without really realizing that we're expecting that. Just thinking about how we get so uncomfortable, that we kind of look to the person who's dying to make us comfortable so that we can have a conversation. And that's just backwards. And when I realized that, I was like, wow, that is really powerful and something to really think about. Are we putting more on this person so that we don't have to be uncomfortable? So I don't know if you all have experienced that. I also want to talk about something else too, but I'm curious if any of you have gone through, I think some of you have gone through, where you've had someone in your life who has gone through this process. And I'm wondering if you found that to be the case, that people are expecting them, the person who's dying of cancer or whatever it may be, to make other people feel better. We're just heaping more onto them when they're already dealing with this. So that was a huge thing for me when I saw that. Wow, especially the doctor was kind of waiting for this clue that, the person's ready to hear this. Well, when are you ever ready to hear this?
When I love the line, he said, it's not like I have my bag packed and I'm waiting for the taxi. It's like he knew that he was dying. It was, evident in his physical, manifestation and so on. But, we don't tend to declare, I'm ready.
Right.
I have known some people who have said, I'm done, no more treatment. I just wanted to spend my time, peacefully and so on.
Yeah.
So call on somebody, see what they say.
I want to just share a couple of quotes that I loved.
Sure. Yeah.
It's easier to search for readiness than to process what its absence means.
Yeah, I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah. And we want neatness and containment, not the spill of grief. But death is never neat. A good death is my favorite. A good death should be defined by how well and honestly we care for the dying, not by their performance on our behalf.
Yeah, just really powerful, just beautifully written article.
Yeah. So why do we expect the dying to be ready at all? Why do we expect that? So I don't know. What are your thoughts? I'm curious. I know that when I was asking if any of you have gone through this, Allison, you were shaking your head. So maybe I'll just pass it off to you.
Yeah. My husband died of pancreatic cancer. So he fought stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 11 months. So I actually went through exactly this. And there were sort of two elements to it. There were times where even if he had been able to come back to fight his way back somehow, it was going to be such a path back. And at a certain point, he said, I just can't go on. And that was the point at which he chose to take that other road. Now, could he have come back? He had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. People do sometimes. But in that moment, he was like, I can't go on. Now, between that moment and when he actually died, he went back and forth. So there were times where he was like, I am done. And I called all his friends and I said, he is dying. It's soon. And if you want to see him before that happens, get here now. And I was that blunt about it. I mean, he looked like a walking skull. my mother-in-law did not want him to die. And so when we were talking to the hospice people, and he said, I want a DNR, which is what you need for hospice in New York. She said, oh, no, you don't want that. And so there can be the edge of, are they ready to die? And then there can be the piece of, are the people around them who love them ready for them to die, which can honestly put a lot of pressure on. In order for him to have a straight conversation with the hospice worker, I had to literally send his mother-in-law into the kitchen and tell him to talk fast and say whatever it was he wanted.
And I know that hospice workers are trained to address those things, that they're patient or wishes oriented and so on, but it's still a difficult scenario.
Well, I mean, but I have a horrific hospice story. So I was falling apart at the end, and I needed to go away for a few days and just take care of myself, be able to scream and cry without restriction, without scaring him, without having to worry about him. I just had to do that for myself because I could feel we were coming to the end. And so had a meeting with hospice. Hospice was set up to take care of him while I was gone for 3 days, and had a very straight conversation about, you are not talking about cremation or burial or anything like that while I am away. It is not your purview while I am gone. So the social worker took it upon herself to ask him if he wanted to be buried or cremated while I was gone. And he called me up absolutely hysterical. And I called the doctor and ripped a strip of skin off him. And he said that the social worker was right, because otherwise he might have wound up in Potter's Field. True story.
Yeah, so it really illustrates the balance between what the survivors need individually and what priority that would be, and what the dying person needs. And then what they one of the questions is, how do we strike that balance, and who's responsible for it? And if we can't talk about the dying process sooner, we're left to coming down to the end of the runway, what maybe knowing what it is and generally not knowing what it is, and just having all that angst that piles up and so on. Carol, what are your thoughts?
Well, unfortunately and fortunately, I have had to walk this several times, starting out with my mother-in-law, my father, my mother, and going through this with them. Learned and made a ton of mistakes with my mother-in-law by not listening to her wishes, but trying to redirect them, or to get what her son wanted or what her daughter wanted. And instead of, just hearing what she had to say and separating that from what my husband and his sister were saying, and trying to bring that together. So when I say a learning experience, it was a definite learning experience for me. And I made a lot of mistakes. I asked questions but no, I really want to know. I want to understand what you're feeling. Explain it to me. You look good. How are you feeling today? What are you feeling? And why aren't you eating? And I just wanted to know every minute detail of the death process. That's not where she wanted to be. She wanted to talk about her art. She wanted to talk about the beauty. She wanted to tell stories. And so, you take that step back and you go, wait, I'm going about this wrong. I need to listen. I need to hear, but I also need to listen and hear what my husband and his sister are saying, so I can help pull the family together. And so in the next stage, when I'm with my father, I became, which I love, which was the quote that Christy was talking about at the end of it, and is being a caregiver for them listening to what their wishes are, and being able to help facilitate some of those ideas and wishes and desires that they have as they're there. And as time has gone on, I have studied a lot more and have just completed my end of life doula training. So this particular segment is very meaningful to me, and there's a lot for us to learn. But the crux of the articles that you provided for us, Candace, I would say there's even more to it. And the bottom line is really being able to listen and hear what the dying are saying, to listen and hear what their family and siblings are saying, and figuring out how to pull that all together to get the answers that they're all looking for. So you can give them the type of space, the type of depth, the type of stories, the type of love, the type of funeral, the type of celebration of life, if that's what they want. Sometimes it's even leading them in the direction of, okay, how would you like your funeral to be? And if you were there, how would you like it to be? If they have brought the subject up to you. So there's so many variables to this. It's one that's very complex. It's one that we're just learning and opening our eyes to. Mm-hmm. But to me, the most important thing is listening and hearing what they have to say, and then possibly knowing some of the way to direct them to open them up so you can get some of the information that you need for the rest of the family too.
And I think also acknowledging when, they're not, I don't want to use the word ready, but opening up is not something that they want to do at that moment. Mm-hmm. And in my day job as an attorney that does estate planning and so on, there is a legal directive in Ohio where you can memorialize your instructions. And I generally, what will occur is, I press them early on to write their instructions. I'm going to share the first one time I did it when the form first became available, the standardized form. It was an elderly man who knew he was terminal. We didn't know when he was going to go. And I talked about, we could be explicit about the instructions. This is a form of a legacy for the family. It takes the burden of possible infighting and decision-making off of their shoulders when it's the most painful to be talking about. So he was very explicit in his instructions, and he said he wanted a 3-day wake, open casket. He wanted to be in a tuxedo, and he wanted his zipper down. Now, he would never tell me why he wanted his zipper down. When he passed, the family would not tell me that backstory, but apparently it was a story in the family. But it was such a thoughtful thing he did. But that I was able to have that conversation because I wasn't steeped in the emotion that he was feeling or the family was feeling. So it's that ease of being able to have the conversation, but also to know when we can't press.
Candace, I think what you're referring to is something that more of us have to do, and that is talk about these things way before we get to that stage of end of life. When my father-in-law was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, my mother-in-law refused to have anybody tell my father-in-law he had cancer and he was dying. And he knew. It was obvious he knew. And we asked my mother-in-law all along, what is it you need us to do? And she said, absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. And so we had no idea of what was going to happen. The doctors originally gave him 3 months. He made it 5. But what I learned from that was how different his death was going to be for me than my father and mother. They had everything planned. They sat us down as they did, all their paperwork. And they explained, why I was the holder of their living will and my brother was not. Why my brother was going to take care of their financials. And there was no infighting. It was like, this is what they want. And I'm so glad.
Go ahead.
I'm so glad that Rich and I took those steps, and Alex took those steps too. Because one of the things that, Candace mentioned to me at one point, Alex is an adult. And if anything were to happen to him, that if it's not stated, he would become a ward of the court. And that was the first thing Alex said was, no, I want people to know what I want. And this conversation, I think, is so important because my boys know exactly what I want, and they tease me about it a lot. Hey, Mom, we know you want a Jewish funeral, but when was the last time you went to temple? Okay, you're right, but it's what I want. And I know that they will take care of that for me. And, I'm not going to know if they do it or not at the end, but it's a peaceful, comfortable conversation.
Well, and it's also the screen through which those of us that are left behind look through just, our memories of that individual. So if it's a really messy, angsty episode, it takes a long time to work through that. And if, at least some of the pieces are eliminated, some of the points of contention or confusion or just, plain old not knowing and wondering if you're doing the right thing, whether we're talking about the dying process or we're talking about, people's arrangements and so on.
The other point that I'd like to bring up, though, and yes, I agree with everything that we're saying here, is that in the moment it can change. We know how we feel right now, but we don't know how we're going to feel when we're actually going through it. The other part of it is when you have this period of time, especially when it's an extended period of time like Allison had, she's already starting the grieving process.
Yep.
And so you have different levels and different planes that people are on. And how do you deal? Yes. And that is the most difficult thing to be able to do, is to find that balance. Hospice is supposed to be there to help you through that, as is an end-of-life doula, if you choose to have one coming in, and to help work with hospice and the family, those grieving, and actually the one going through it. So this is a very important conversation to be having. And how do we deal with it? Because you have many different players, and they're all equally as important in working together on this.
Well, and Christy had a great thing that she talked about, or briefly. Rose, do you want to mention that, Christy?
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys remember, but a few episodes ago, I talked about the death deck. And the death deck actually released another deck, and this is called the End of Life deck. And I ordered that, so I do have that. And again, they're not paying me to tell people about this, but this is really specifically for families and caregivers, healthcare providers who are helping people go through this like end of life process. So there are all different kinds of questions and things that you can use this as a tool to help people be able to talk about this during, before, or during, and then, the death deck is kind of, you can do it anytime, after, before, during, whenever. So let me just share some of the questions here. I thought they were really, some of the ones I really liked were, would you consider having a living wake? Which I thought was really interesting. Have you ever heard of anybody doing a living wake where they
No, but I wonder if that client of mine would have had his zipper down.
I thought that was
probably
really
would.
interesting. Another question is, as you approach the end, what would you like to hear? And then they give some options, podcasts or inspirational words, my favorite music, ocean or natural sounds, just so that you are kind of informed about what they may want. I would like my celebration of life or memorial service too. And then they give you some options, or you could just use these just to ask the questions.
Yeah, but at least it starts the dialogue.
Yeah, it does.
To Christy's point of these cards, we've already started using them in groups. Now, and you have to be careful what groups you're using them, but with friends, and we're having these conversations. Yeah, I think it's important to start the conversation now where, again, we've talked so many times about our community is not prepared for this anymore. And this is starting to prepare the community for it by opening up these dialogues and having these conversations and writing down and listening to others.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing the death deck. That has opened up a lot of conversation.
Is there another one, Chrissy, you were going to say?
I'd have a bunch of them. I just thought it was really interesting. I like the idea that there are two different sets so that, you know, this is really specific to end of life, which I think is really neat. Are there any conversations you haven't been able to have that are on your mind? That's a really...
Well, and that's the training you and I have had in terms of the uncommunicated things is the source of the suffering.
Right.
When somebody's gone. Yeah.
Yes, that's very important. How confident are you about what happens after death? These are the ones I'm reading right now. I actually have 3 options with them, like you can choose, but then they have other options that are just, you know, just an idea. This is about fear. Share a fear you have about death and dying. Maybe by discussing it, we can alleviate some of its intensity. Another one, brief guide. What's one piece of advice you'd like your family and friends to know to help ease their grieving process? So there, I mean, there are all kinds. There are so many, and it's just so good to, you know, use. I think it would be really helpful, especially for healthcare workers, to use these.
And these are all part of the end of life training. All the questions that you're bringing up, and even more. So it's interesting that we are going in this direction with this podcast, and I'm loving it. I just feel really good about it, and I hope our audience is gleaning a lot from it too.
Allison, you look like you wanted to say something.
I do. So it kind of brings up some questions in that you have all different parties. You have the people who love the person who's dying, and you have the person who's dying, who very often has less energy to stand for themselves. And so one of the questions that I think is important is who stands for that person? Because the experience of dying is somewhat confusing. I mean, my grandfather was afraid to say what he saw as he began to see people who had gone, hear music when there was no music. And he was scared that we would think he was crazy. And so he was very reluctant to talk about these experiences as he came closer and closer to death. He died when he was 99. My mother-in-law is 99. She'll be 100 in about 3 weeks. And so sort of going up to that edge and stepping back. You know, so there were times when he was peaceful. There were times when he was scared. My grandfather, we took him up to Maine. He was 97. It was a royal pain in the neck to get him there at that point. But he said, if I die here, I'm good with that. That's okay. That would actually be my preferred way to go. And he didn't die, but he was like, it's not on you if I die. When Dave, my husband, was speaking right up to the end, right up to the last 15 minutes. And he asked me a whole bunch of questions. Well, what about my mom? What about my studio? What about my art? What about this? What about that? And so there was this pull between being ready to go, as far as I could tell, and being concerned that the things that he cared about here would be taken care of. And I just kept saying, I've got it. I've got it. You know, I said, In a body, you need breath and love. Outside of a body, you just need love. So when you're ready, go out on the love.
Yeah, and how often people do have more concern about the people they're leaving behind than they're necessarily concentrating on themselves. One of the things in the article they talk about is the idea of insisting on protecting the people they're leaving behind. And then how do we broach that without breaching the boundaries that we probably should have with the person who's dying? And how do we take care of the person who is being left behind? That balance between the two. So, Carol, what about your training? What have you learned?
What I've learned from it is that it's important to listen to what the individual who is dying in and of themselves. So the rest of the family is not there. And then to also listen to the individual family members and see if there's a common thread or a way to pull some of it together. But you don't want to have a confrontation. You want to be able to have them each have their own say and draw it in. And to even take it further than that, going back to some of what Allison was saying about her husband, some of the other things that they would suggest doing during that time, you can also bring in, as you're having that conversation with them, doing some Reiki or bringing the music in and the meditation in to calming them, the senses and the incense, just to relieve some of the stress. But you do want to respond to their answers in as positive a way as you can. And you want to pull all that information together and hopefully be able to come up with something that works for all of them. Mm-hmm. It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's
like a very difficult thing to do.
Balance sport. It's never really going to be perfect.
Absolutely,
and
but you don't want to have
them
all in one. Well, the same thing for younger individuals. You don't want everyone in the room at one time if they're coming from totally different angles, mm-hmm. or not wanting to express answers to some of the questions that are being asked, or vice versa, if they're questions that they want asked that others aren't willing to engage in. So you're a mediator. Mm-hmm. You're definitely a mediator.
Now, listen, you brought up that bad experience with hospice, and we also had a very bad experience. Yet we had another layer of assistance. So they are the chaplains who help sort things out for you to get palliative care or go into hospice. And so when that hospice group was, I felt, working against us, I had them to reach out to. They were my savior. The problem I had afterwards is I was up in Michigan with my mom. Then I moved back to Ohio, and I had no support system here. I didn't even know how to find it. So you were in New York with your husband. What was it that the hospice care wasn't giving to you, or that you felt was missing?
Well, I mean, we gave them very specific directions that he needed my support when we had these conversations to a degree, but I was to be here when those conversations were had. He was not to have them with strangers. So they directly went against our specific directives. And, what we wanted was for them to listen to what we had to say and honor our wishes. And that didn't happen because they thought they knew better.
Yeah, and that can be a matter of, unartful people, because and I think it really underscores the issue that we don't have an opportunity to have these conversations earlier about what is hospice, what is their role, and so on. And then to be really clear, I went through something similar with my husband, and he was very firm about what his instructions were. He was cogent to the end, and he made his wishes known. That there was one particularly officious nurse, or I can't remember what her status was and so on. And he put in a call to the doctor. He was fortunate. He was a doctor, and he was fortunate he could make that call. But I think we could do a better job as a society to understand these services and so on, and then to understand what's on the other side of it, to address your concern, Karen, because, you know, it's like it's full on and then it's not, and then you have to go to another source.
Well, and again, this is where an end of life doula does come into play, and they do stay with the family afterwards and work with them for a number of months. So they're there from the time that obviously they're called in and the issue is going on, and then they will be there 24/7, just about when the family wants them, or the person who is
How
passing.
many people know about end of life doulas?
And they're becoming more. They're becoming yes,
because of the need.
Because of the need, but they'll run the errands for you. They'll check into services for you. They'll check options for you, different types of burials for you. And they will stay with you at the end through part of the grieving period too. Sometimes 6 months up to a year. So there is that additional help for the family, that additional source for the family to pull on and to rely on.
And what I really love about it is it really shows that maybe as a society, we are getting more, not comfortable, but more willing, I guess, to be open to be having those conversations. I mean, just the death deck and the end of life, you know, the dying cards and so on, and the end of life doulas. It gives me hope that we can be at least more realistic that these things are coming, and we're either prepared or we're not prepared, and there's always going to be some element of not being fully prepared.
But we're also seeing many more podcasts and many more movies and books and discussions on the death and how to prepare for it.
And there's the Death Cafe, that whole movement where people are talking about it and so on.
Except
absolutely.
Across the pandemic in the last few years, there used to be grief groups, a lot of grief groups that held up the what you were talking to, Karen. How do you have support if you were in one place and you moved to another place? There were set up groups for grief, and across the pandemic, a lot of them vanished. I was hearing on a number of the podcasts I was on. They just disappeared into the wind. It was very, very, very hard to find grief support of that kind that used to exist quite a lot. I belong to Gilda's Club, which is cancer, caregivers, people with cancer, and bereaved. My husband died, and they know about this stuff, right? They said, okay, now you're moving into the bereavement group. And I was like, I don't know any of these people. My husband has just died. And this is an environment where people are coming up to that edge all the time. And even them were like, okay, our system says you're moving on to this piece.
Well, and the other part that occurs to me when you say that, Allison, is we often talk about the Dr. Kubler-Ross, you know, the stages of dying, and that's not the same thing as the stages of grief. You know, it's not one according to schedule, obviously, but there isn't the denial, and so on. The science has proven that. So it's unfortunate that we have to kind of institutionalize some of these so-called services in order to make them accessible, I guess is what my theory would be. So, you know, kind of looking at what we want to be able to convey to the listeners, what do you think is the most important thing from each of you that you would want them to take away from the conversation today?
Well, for me,
go ahead.
Any of you, each one of you.
I was just going to say really what I said before. It was just so powerful to me to realize that we may inadvertently be putting a lot of pressure on this person who is already having to deal with this end of life process. And we may not, it could be the person we love the most in the world and not realize that we're actually doing that. And that just really made me pause and think I really need to have my eyes wide open here.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Once again, it's so individualized. Everyone is a player in it. And the most important thing you can do is realize that there isn't a right or wrong, but everyone's a player. They all have different wishes and desires. And how do you listen? How do you hear? And how do you help facilitate everyone working together on it? And the most important one, obviously, is the one who is dying, but everyone else is equally important in their grieving and how they're handling it. So it's listening. It's actually listening and then acting upon those wishes.
And then Allison, what about you?
I guess I would say I would agree with everybody else so far, but I would say that it's really important to measure the energy that dying takes and the energy that it takes to grieve when someone's dying. Because it may not be possible to have conversations. It may be possible to hold a hand. Mm-hmm. It may be possible to have life go around the person. My father died at home, and his being there meant that people weren't coming to a hospital room for a couple of hours. They were like wandering into the room with a baby and wandering out when the energy waned. So I would say listen, but also pay attention to the energy, what's actually needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree with you.
Then Karen, what about you? Anything you think that we should make sure that you convey?
I'm just grateful that I learned from my parents to talk about these things early on. As difficult as it was, I at least knew that I was doing what they wanted. And that part wasn't about me. The part about me was after their funeral, how I was going to move forward. And I'm hoping that as this podcast group, we're going to be able to provide even more to our listeners. Maybe having, an event where we actually use those decks of cards, Chrissy, letting people know how normalized that is. And that's what we have to do. If that's what we want for ourselves, then we have to start taking that stand. There's also a nurse on Facebook. She's a hospice nurse. And she talks about how her patients are dying. And it's all different. And she said, in order to be a good hospice care person, you have to listen to the patient. This is their last hurrah. Mm-hmm. And I hope we can help others do that.
And for me, what stood out is, being more willing, all of us, to have these really challenging conversations, sometimes challenging conversations, whether we know the end is imminent or maybe more distant. But, I think those cards, if people would use them, would be a great way to facilitate some of the difficult conversations. Well, so anything else before we part?
Thank you, Candace, for bringing this subject up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to thank the authors for those articles and having the New York Times repeat one from 2018.
I would say give yourself grace navigating this stuff. It's not that easy. Mm-hmm. Nobody really knows how to do it, and there is no right.
And you don't get a second chance as a rule, right?
Exactly.
I love that, Allison. Thank you for saying that. That's
really... one other thing that I would add is it's never too soon or too late to work with a grief coach. And it's something that I think so many people would benefit going forward in their life. And, you know, I've been doing that, and it just touches so many other parts of my life that I feel richer for it. So to all of you listening out there, you have all of our email addresses if you want to connect with us. If we aren't the right group of people, we know many others who are out there, and we'd be glad to help you out, because you know what? We only have this life. So I think we need to live it to the best that we can. Thank you, ladies. We'll see you all next month. And I'm not sure who's leading next month, but we'll figure that out on our own. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.